In the southeastern part of the Mexican state of Chihuahua, where the plain gives way to the arid Bolsón de Mapimi Basin, locals have been telling essentially the same story from nearly a century, changing only the names and dates. A person leaves home to check on the livestock, lock the gate, or look for a stray animal, and doesn't return that same evening. Some are found a few hours or days later, disoriented, dehydrated, and unable to explain exactly where they had been or what had happened to them. Others are never found. And in almost every one of these cases, if you question the witnesses carefully enough, the same detail emerges, one that has been recurring for decades with frightening consistency. On that very same night, one of the neighbors, and sometimes several people at once, strangers to one another, saw lights in the sky above the low ridges of the Sierra, motionless, silent. Today's story is about Ernesto Garcia Villarreal, a man whom his neighbors all described in the same way: reliable, taciturn, and devoid of any tendency toward fantasy. He was born in 1960 in the municipality of Jimenez in the state of Chihuahua, into a family that had raised livestock on that land for 3 generations. La Esmeralda Ranch, 640 hectares of semi-arid land in the southeastern part of the state, not far from the Florido River, was passed down to him from his father in 1984, and since then, Ernesto has never left it for more than a week at a time. He was married to Maricela Ortiz. They raised 2 children, their son Ruben, who was 19 in 2003, and their daughter Yolanda, who was 15. Neighbors recalled that Ernesto drove a light beige 1994 Ford F-150 pickup truck, which he kept in perfect condition, changed the oil himself, and never allowed himself to drink before getting behind the wheel. He wasn't a religious fanatic, but he faithfully attended Sunday Mass at the parish church in Jimenez. He didn't like the conversations about ghosts and UFOs that the workers would occasionally bring up over dinner, and he usually cut them short with a brief, "Enough of this nonsense. We've got work to do." It was precisely this reputation as a man completely devoid of imagination that later became one of the investigators' main arguments against the theory that it was a prank or a mental breakdown. Maricela recalled that in 21 years of marriage, she had never once heard her husband talk about a bad dream, and whenever she occasionally mentioned an omen or a premonition, he invariably responded with the same saying, which their children later adopted: "The earth doesn't lie. Everything else is just the result of too much free time." March 6, 2003 was an ordinary Thursday. During the day, the temperature at the ranch rose to 26 degrees, typical for the end of the dry season in this part of the Chihuahuan desert, where the average annual temperature hovers around 18.5 degrees, and the temperature difference between the daytime heat and the nighttime cold can reach 20 degrees in just a few hours. Ernesto had been making the rounds of the southern pastures since early that morning with his employee, Jose Luis Ramos, a 27-year-old who had been working on the ranch for 6 years, and was the only person other than the family who remained in the house that evening. During the day, there were no signs of anything out of the ordinary. We repaired the fence by the watering hole, checked on the young animals, and had lunch on the covered porch. Maricela later recalled that her husband had been in his usual mood, except that he mentioned over dinner that the cattle in the northern pen had been acting restless for the 3rd day in a row. The cows were huddling together, refusing to go to the water, and on the night of March 5th, one of the young bulls somehow broke a fence post and ran off 2 kilometers, even though he had never shown such agility before. Ernesto himself attributed it to coyotes or a puma, which occasionally came down from the low ridges of the Sierra de los Remedios, stretching east of the ranch. At 8:30 in the evening, when it had grown dark and the stars were shining as brightly as they do only far from the cities, he grabbed his rifle, a walkie-talkie, and a flashlight, and told his wife that he was going to check on the northern corral. For about 40 minutes, no more. Maricela stayed behind to wash the dishes. Ruben was studying for his exam at the kitchen table, and Yolanda was watching TV in the next room. By all accounts, nothing about that evening was any different from the hundreds that had come before. The town of Jimenez itself, the administrative center of the municipality, is located 38 kilometers from the La Esmeralda via a dirt road that, about halfway there, joins Federal Highway 49, which continues on to Camargo and, ultimately, north to the state capital. Life here revolved around the Sunday market in the square by the church, around the school where Yolanda studied, and around several dozen families who, like the Garcias, Villarreals, had been raising livestock on this land since the middle of the last century and knew each other well, not only by name, but also by the make of their pickup trucks and the voices on the walkie-talkies set to the common frequency used by nearly all the surrounding ranches for emergency communication. The house on La Esmeralda, a low, elongated structure made of adobe and fired brick, with a veranda running along the south wall, and a tin roof that, at night, as it cooled after the daytime heat, made a distinctive crackling sound, stood on a small hill, about 1.5 kilometers from the nearest neighbor's property. Her neighbor, Aurelio Chavez, from the El Novio ranch, which we'll discuss later, was the only one whose lights Maricela could make out at night from her kitchen window. A tiny speck of light on the horizon that, in her own words, she had grown so used to that she no longer noticed it, until after March 7th, when she began to stare at it every night, as if expecting something else to light up in its place. At 8:45, Ernesto radioed Jose Luis to ask him to drive the second pickup truck to the gate of the North Pen, a routine request, with nothing out of the ordinary in his voice. At 9:02, he got back in touch, and this time, according to Jose Luis, there was something new in his voice. Not panic, but rather the focused bewilderment of a man trying to make sense of what he was seeing before him. He said that the cattle had huddled together at the far end of the corral, and that, above the mountains, about 1.5 to 2 kilometers away, he could see 3 motionless bluish lights arranged in a triangle. Jose Luis asked if they were the headlights of a car on the road, and Ernesto replied that they weren't. There was no road there, and the lights were too high and too steady, without any of the flickering typical of headlights or campfires. Then, according to Jose Luis, there was a pause of about 10 to 12 seconds, after which Ernesto's voice changed. It became quieter and more subdued, as if he were continuing to speak, while at the same time listening intently for something. He said the lights were starting to get closer. Then came the sentence that remained unfinished and has perhaps become the most quoted phrase in the entire case. Jose Luis, they're not moving like, they just... And the connection was cut off. Not with static or interference, but instantly, as if the walkie-talkie had been turned off with the push of a button. Jose Luis tried to get the owner's attention for nearly 20 more minutes before waking up Maricela. The discovery took place in 2 stages. First, around 9:30 in the evening, Jose Luis drove the second pickup to the northern corral and saw Ernesto's pickup. It was parked on the shoulder of the dirt road running alongside the fence, with its headlights on and the engine idling. The driver's side door was open. A rifle lay on the seat, untouched, with the safety on. The radio was lying on the floor of the cab, still turned on. In the cup holder sat a metal mug with some coffee left in it. Maricela later confirmed during questioning that her husband had taken a thermos with him before leaving, and judging by the residual heat recorded by the police officers who arrived at dawn, the coffee remained warm for several more hours after his disappearance, even though the nighttime temperature at the ranch had dropped to 4 degrees that night. No traces of blood or signs of a struggle were found inside or outside the car. The second, far more alarming phase of the search took place on the morning of March 7th, when a group of municipal police officers from Jimenez, led by Comandante Rogelio Salcido, arrived and began combing the area around the abandoned pickup truck. 40 meters from the car, on a patch of ground still damp from a recent rain, they discovered a trail of footprints from size 42 boots, the exact size Ernesto wore, that began at the spot where, judging by the indentations, he had stopped and, apparently, stood motionless for a while, and then ended exactly after 2 steps. After that, nothing. No continuation of the trail, no drag marks, no footprints from a fall, and not the slightest sign that the person had turned around, run away, or been dragged away. The ground around it remained smooth, as if untouched, for several meters in every direction. The police brought 2 search dogs from the station in Camargo. Upon reaching this spot, both stopped, refused to go any further, and, according to their handler, behaved as if they were running into an invisible wall. They whimpered and backed away. One of them, named Canyon, flatly refused to approach that spot for the next 2 days of the search. 23 meters from where the trail ended, slightly off to the side, at the foot of a low hill, the search team discovered an almost perfect circle, about 4 meters in diameter, where the soil looked as if it had been melted, caked into a glassy crust that was dark gray, almost black in places, brittle to the touch, as the search participants later reported. They had been allowed to touch it before the forensic experts arrived. Jose Luis, who had driven through that same stretch the night before in search of a stray bull, claimed that there was no circle there, and that he would have noticed it, because he drove that road regularly and knew the area down to the last bush. The grass and low mesquite shrubs within the circle's radius had not been burned in the usual sense, but rather had dried out and crumbled to dust at the slightest touch. The police were never able to explain this phenomenon. No traces of a fire, fuel cans, electrical equipment, or other evidence that might indicate the scorched area was caused by human activity were found. A forensic expert who arrived from the city of Chihuahua only on the third day due to a lack of transportation at the branch office noted in the report that the needle of his compass behaved erratically in the immediate vicinity of the circle, deviating by 15 to 20 degrees from the true direction. Although at a distance of 10 meters from the center of the stain, the instrument indicated the correct direction, a detail which he himself considered, in his own words, more curious than conclusive, but which he included in the report at the insistence of Commander Salcido. The soil samples were later sent for analysis to a laboratory in the city of Chihuahua, but, according to the official account, the results were never published, and the research report itself, as the family later claimed, was lost during the transfer of the case between courts, a circumstance that proponents of the anomalous theory consider one of the most alarming facts of the case, while skeptics attribute it to simple bureaucratic negligence, which, alas, was not uncommon in the system at that time. Within the first 24 hours of her disappearance, not only the municipal police, but also Arturo Dominguez Reyes, an agent with the state prosecutor's office, became involved in the case. He would go on to lead the investigation for the next 2 years. The first and most obvious theory was a kidnapping for ransom. In the early 2000s, cases of extortion targeting ranch owners became more frequent in northern Mexico. And although Ernesto wasn't a wealthy man, he owned enough valuable real estate and livestock to make him a potential target. However, the story began to fall apart just a week later. Not a single ransom call was ever received, neither to the family, nor to the police, nor through intermediaries, which is completely uncharacteristic of a classic kidnapping for ransom, since kidnappers in such cases usually make contact within the first 72 hours. The second theory, an accident, an attack by a wild animal, or a fall into one of the old, abandoned wells, of which there were at least 5 on the ranch and in the surrounding area, also failed to hold up to scrutiny. The wells were inspected using ropes and portable cameras brought in from the neighboring municipality of Camargo, and not a single trace was found in any of them. The puma, which was initially blamed for disturbing the livestock, did indeed live in the Sierra de los Remedios mountains, but a wildlife expert called in by the district attorney's office stated that no attack by a predator of that size could explain the complete absence of blood, torn clothing, or signs of a struggle at the scene. The third possibility, which Agent Dominguez Reyes considered with obvious reluctance but could not entirely rule out, involved a voluntary departure, a flight from debt, family problems, or a second secret life. This theory was investigated particularly thoroughly, since it was the least costly option for the investigation and the most convenient for officially closing the case. They checked Ernesto's bank accounts, which turned out to be in perfect order, without a single suspicious transaction. They interviewed dozens of people in Jimenez and neighboring Camargo regarding a possible mistress or hidden conflicts. No one, including the local priest, Father Cirilo Najera, who had heard Ernesto's confessions for 15 years, could point to a single lead. Moreover, a fact came to light that the investigators deemed significant. Literally the day before his disappearance, Ernesto had put down a deposit on a new tractor and made arrangements with a neighbor to jointly purchase feed for the coming season. The behavior of someone who was clearly planning for the future, not preparing to disappear. Radar stations in the Chihuahua area and at the nearby military air base on the night of March 6th to 7th, according to the military's official response to a request from the prosecutor's office, did not detect any aerial objects over the municipality of Jimenez. A response that, however, skeptics find unconvincing, given that low-flying and slow-moving objects often remain outside the reliable detection range of civilian and even some military radars of that era. What proved far more significant to the case was that on the same night, between approximately 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock p.m., 3 more people within a 15-kilometer radius of the La Esmeralda Ranch independently reported observing similar light phenomena, and none of them knew anything about Ernesto's disappearance at the time they gave their statements. Benjamin Ochoa Rios, A 38-year-old truck driver traveling on Federal Highway 49 toward Camargo pulled his truck over to the side of the road at approximately 9:15 p.m. to, as he put it, make sure he wasn't falling asleep at the wheel. Over the ridge of hills to the left of the road, he saw 3 motionless bluish-white lights that, after remaining in place for about a minute, began to slowly shift to the side and then simply went out, as if someone had flipped a switch. Aurelio Chavez, the owner of the neighboring El Novillo ranch 6 kilometers to the east, observed a similar scene from the porch of his own home with his wife Guadalupe at about the same time. The couple, independently of one another, described 3 lights arranged in a triangle, and both insisted that the lights made no sound, which particularly struck Aurelio, who was accustomed to the roar of agricultural helicopters that occasionally flew over the county. The third witness was 16-year-old Ivan Salazar, who was riding his motorcycle home from a party in the village of La Florida. He claimed that the motorcycle's engine stalled for no apparent reason, just as he pulled level with the La Esmeralda ranch, and the motorcycle's headlight began to flash for a few seconds before he, in his words, just opened the throttle and rode off because I felt uneasy. All 3 statements were recorded by investigators separately and independently, on different days, but they presented Agent Dominguez Reyes with a surprisingly consistent picture. Even though neither Ochoa, nor the Chavez family, nor the young Salazar had known each other prior to that moment, and had no opportunity to collude. It is noteworthy that none of the 3 witnesses made the connection between what they had seen and Ernesto's disappearance until the police approached them themselves. Aurelio Chavez only learned of his neighbor's disappearance on the 3rd day, when a convoy of search vehicles drove past his ranch, and only then did he connect the date with his own observation. Agent Dominguez Reyes later noted in a conversation with reporters that it was precisely this lack of knowledge on the part of the witnesses at the time they gave their testimony that served as the decisive argument for him against the theory of collusion or collective suggestion. People don't make up the same story on the very same night unless they have a reason to do so. Skeptics, however, pointed out that sightings of unusual lights over the mountains in this area were not uncommon, either before or after March 2003. Therefore, the coincidence of 3 independent reports on a single night, despite its statistical improbability, does not necessarily indicate a connection to the disappearance, but could be explained by a generally higher frequency of such sightings in this particular part of the state. It was at this stage of the investigation that Agent Dominguez Reyes, while preparing the case file, deemed it necessary to mention in his report, contrary to the usual practice of dry, factual documentation, the historical context of this neighborhood, which local residents had been familiar with long before Ernesto's disappearance. The municipality of Jimenez is located entirely within the Boson de Mapimi, a vast desert basin at the junction of the states of Chihuahua, Durango, and Coahuila, at the center of which lies the so-called Zone of Silence, Zona del Silencio, well known throughout Mexico, an area where, according to numerous documented cases dating back to at least 1930, pilots and radio operators' communications and navigation equipment have failed. The first such incident is believed to have been the one involving pilot Francisco Sarabia, whose onboard instruments and radio communication suddenly failed while flying over this area. In 1970, an American research rocket, Athena, launched from a test site in New Mexico, crashed in the same area after veering off its calculated trajectory by hundreds of kilometers for unexplained reasons. This incident drew the attention of the U.S. military to the region at the time and prompted the Mexican government to build a small research station there. For decades, local residents have told stories of scorched circles on the ground, malfunctions in all kinds of electronic devices, and 3 pale, silent figures who, according to legend, were occasionally seen at the foot of low ridges at sunset. Some of the researchers who worked at the biological station built there in the 1970s claim that the level of ultraviolet radiation in this part of the desert is 1/3 higher than in neighboring areas, although this claim has never been independently scientifically verified and remains, to this day, more a matter of local folklore than an established fact. Guides who lead tourists and explorers through the Bolson de Mapimi still warn visitors not to rely on a compass or count on reliable radio communication in these areas, advice that locals take for granted, while visitors usually dismiss it as superstition until they see for themselves that it's true. The La Esmeralda Ranch is located right on the edge of this zone, within approximately 28 kilometers of the anomaly's approximate center, a fact that in and of itself proves nothing, but which, as Agent Dominguez Reyes noted in his report, cannot be completely ignored when assessing the overall picture of the incident. In this context, the investigation uncovered 3 more episodes from the history of the ranch itself and its surroundings, which had previously been considered local legends, but were re-examined after Ernesto's disappearance. In 1989, at a neighboring ranch, Los Alamos, owned by Anastasio Beltran, 7 head of cattle died overnight under circumstances that a veterinarian called in from Jimenez described in his report as unexplained. The animals were missing certain internal organs and sections of soft tissue, with a complete absence of blood at and around the carcasses, and there were no signs of predators or insects on the cut surfaces. Anastasio Beltran himself, who was already quite elderly by then, declined the compensation offered by the municipality, telling a local newspaper that it would be a sin to take money for something like that, and for the rest of his life kept photographs of the carcasses taken by the veterinarian in his ranch office, just in case, as he explained, someone might one day want to compare them with a new, similar case. In 1996, a local shepherd named Efren Portillo went missing in a pasture near that same ridge of hills and was found 4 days later, 18 kilometers from where he had disappeared, disoriented, dehydrated, but physically unharmed. He himself later claimed that, to him, at most an hour or 2 had passed, and for the rest of his life, he never agreed to discuss this episode in detail with journalists, limiting himself to the brief statement, "I saw something that shouldn't have been there." And in the year 2001, a local priest, that very same Padre Cirilo Naquera, sent a letter to the diocese in which he reported an increasing number of instances where parishioners, after evening mass, told him they had seen lights over the mountains, and asked for advice on how to respond to such revelations from his flock without undermining their faith. A copy of this letter, discovered by journalists after the Ernesto case, became one of the few written pieces of evidence showing that alarming observations in this area had been systematically documented, rather than having been fabricated retroactively in connection with a single high-profile incident. Another coincidence that caught the attention of journalists covering the Garcia Villarreal case, after it had already gained national attention, pertains not to the past, but to the future. Specifically, March 2003. On March 5, 2004, almost exactly 1 year after Ernesto's disappearance, with a difference of just 2 days, the crew of a military aircraft Merlin C-26A of the Mexican Air Force, which was conducting a routine patrol flight against drug trafficking over the state of Campeche, detected, using an infrared camera, 11 unidentified objects moving at high speed and with no visible heat source in the visible spectrum. On May 12th of that year, Mexican Defense Minister General Clemente Vega Garcia made a decision unprecedented for the Mexican armed forces to publicly confirm the authenticity of the recording and hand it over to independent researcher Jaime Mozano for analysis, stating at a press conference at the Sevilla Palace Hotel in Mexico City that the armed forces do not engage in fabrications. This was the first, and at that time, the only, instance in which a country's military department had officially acknowledged the authenticity of a video recording of unidentified flying objects. For the family and attorneys of Garcia Villarreal, this incident, which, on the surface, had no connection to their relative's case, became an important psychological and public argument. If the country's top military leadership acknowledges the existence of unexplained aerial phenomena over one Mexican state, it becomes more difficult for skeptics to dismiss out of hand the possibility of similar phenomena in another. Despite all this, the investigation into Ernesto's disappearance had effectively reached a dead end by the end of 2003. Maricela and the children posted hundreds of flyers with a photo of Ernesto throughout the southern part of the state of Chihuahua. From Jimenez to Camargo and Oyenagi, they reached out to local television stations and held 2 press conferences in front of City Hall. Relatives and volunteers combed the area on foot within a radius of nearly 40 square kilometers around the ranch, enlisted the help of search specialists from the neighboring state of Coahuila, and hired a private investigator from the city of Chihuahua, who, however, in 3 months of work, found nothing that the police hadn't already found. The Jimenez community, as is often the case in such situations, split into 2 camps. Some believed that Ernesto had fallen victim to the cartel, which later covered its tracks out of fear of publicity. Others spoke openly of something from the Sierra, a local euphemism for all the inexplicable events that had been taking place in the vicinity of the zone of silence for decades. With no body, no suspects, and not a single convincing theory, the state prosecutor's office had effectively classified the case as unsolved by early 2005, continuing to keep it formally open, but allocating virtually no resources to it. Maricela later said that the hardest part wasn't the disappearance itself, but rather that silence that set in after a year and a half or two. No calls from investigators, no news, and the case's slow, irreversible descent into the dust of the archives. Ruben, who was 19 the year his father disappeared, left his studies in Chihuahua and returned to run the ranch. Yolanda, after graduating from school, left Jimenez and, according to relatives, still avoids talking about her father with strangers. The case remained virtually stalled for more than 10 years. Once a year, usually in early March, Maricela would give a brief statement on a local radio station, reminding listeners of her husband, a ritual she herself described as not hope, but simply a refusal to remain silent. Over the years, 3 different municipal police forces have served in Jimenez. Commander Salcido has retired, and Agent Dominguez Reyes himself, who continued to take an unofficial interest in the case even after it had been officially handed over to another investigator, later admitted that he still keeps a copy of the report on the inspection of the scorched circle at his home, just in case someone asks about it someday. It was against this backdrop of years of calm, 12.5 years after that March night in 2003, that the case of Ernesto Garcia Villarreal unexpectedly found itself back in the spotlight, though for an entirely different reason. In late September 2015, 12.5 years after the disappearance, a truck driver transporting feed between Camargo and Jimenez reported to the local police that approximately 3 kilometers from the federal highway, near the border of the former La Esmeralda ranch, he had seen a barefoot man on the side of the road, whom he estimated to be of advanced age, emaciated and wearing tattered clothes, who stood motionless, staring toward the mountains, and did not respond to his honking. When the driver, alarmed by the sight of the stranger, stopped and tried to approach him, the man, according to the driver, looked at me as if he didn't understand who I was, and then turned and walked away toward the hills with quick, uneven strides, disappearing into the mesquite thickets before the driver could catch up to him. The story would have been dismissed as just another oddity had it not been for a local journalist who was preparing a piece on a decade of unsolved cases in the region for a Chihuahua publication, who compared the description, about 1.75 meters tall, a distinctive scar above the left eyebrow, and graying but once dark hair, with an archival photograph from the Garcia Villarreal case. When Maricela was shown a composite sketch based on the driver's description, she burst into tears and said that, despite the obvious age difference, she recognizes something of Ernesto in his facial features that I can't put into words. The driver himself, Pancho Hidalgo, 31 years old, who had been working for a feed company in Camargo for 6 years, subsequently refused to give any further interviews and, according to his colleagues, continued to avoid that stretch of road for a long time, preferring to take a detour of over 20 kilometers just to avoid passing that turn at dusk. In his initial statement to the local police, long before the story made it into the press and he might have embellished anything in hindsight, he described in detail not only the stranger's appearance, but also his posture. The man stood motionless, his head tilted slightly, as if listening for something coming from the direction of the hills, and did not move for what the driver estimated to be at least a minute before reacting to the sound of the horn. It was precisely this detail, the unnatural stillness of his posture, uncharacteristic of either a traveler taking a rest or a person waiting for a ride, that later led several investigators of the case to draw a parallel with the description that Ernesto himself, if the notebook found later is to be believed, gave of the state of stupor in which, according to him, he was periodically held. This report served as the impetus for resuming the search, this time not by government agencies, but by the civilian search group Buscadores del Bolsón, which brings together relatives of the missing from across southern Chihuahua who, by that time, had already spent several years independently combing through abandoned plots of land, wells, and ravines in the region in search of the remains of their loved ones, a practice that has become a sad necessity in Mexico amid the chronic overload of official search agencies. Over the course of 3 weeks in October 2015, about 20 volunteers, including Ruben, who had grown up and was by then 31 years old, methodically searched the area within a 4-kilometer radius of the spot where the truck had spotted the stranger. It was Reuben who, at his own insistence, had expanded the search area to a spot long overgrown with brush, where a burned circle had been found in 2003, on October 14th discovered, in a shallow gully formed after heavy summer rains, a metal cookie tin partially washed out of the ground, wrapped in a decayed piece of canvas poncho. The box was crushed and covered with rust and dirt so thickly that it took nearly an hour to scrub it clean before it could be opened. Inside, wrapped in the remnants of a plastic bag, which had partially protected the contents from moisture, was a thin, checkered notebook with 52 sheets, the kind sold in any stationery store in Mexico in the early 2000s, filled almost to the last page with neat, though at times nearly illegible handwriting. An analysis conducted later by state prosecutors compared the handwriting to samples from the ranch's business records and letters that Ernesto had kept during his lifetime, and confirmed with a high degree of certainty that the notebook was written in his hand. It was precisely the contents of this notebook, found 12 years after his disappearance and subsequently published only in part with the family's consent, that constituted the most controversial and most detailed part of the entire case, the little that can be called Ernesto's own voice, describing what happened to him on the night of March 7th. Judging by the ink and the pressure of the pen, the first pages of the notebook were apparently written shortly after his disappearance. The handwriting there is relatively even, though noticeably more condensed than in Ernesto's pre-war notes, which the family is familiar with. He writes that he remembers walking toward the ravine to retrieve a calf that had stumbled, when he noticed 3 lights above the ridge. They didn't flicker or hum. They just stood there, as if someone had hung them on invisible threads. He describes how he contacted Jose Luis by walkie-talkie and then, in his own words, took 2 steps toward them. I don't know why. My feet moved before my head could think. And at that moment, as he writes, the air around him became as thick as water in a river in flood, and the sound vanished. Not silence, but specifically the absence of sound, as if my ears were completely blocked. Further on in the notebook, there is a sudden gap in the chronology. The next entry, judging by the handwriting and the color of the ink, was clearly written later. But Ernesto himself, notably, makes no mention of this and continues his narrative as if only seconds, not months, had passed. He describes the space he found himself in as a room without corners. The walls curved where a corner should have been, and there was neither a door nor a window, only the curve itself, illuminated by an even, cold light with no visible source, which he compares to the light of a cloudy morning, only without any sun at all. He writes about a metallic taste in his mouth that wouldn't go away, about a steady hum, felt not with his ears, but somewhere in his bones, and about a complete loss of sense of time. He tried several times to figure out how many days had passed, using his hunger and thirst as guides, which, he says, he hardly felt at all, a fact that frightened him more than the captivity itself. The pages of the notebook that are richest in tactile details are devoted to descriptions of the creatures or figures with whom, according to Ernesto, he was present in that space. He writes of figures slightly shorter than the average man, with heads that he felt were disproportionately large, and skin that he describes in one entry as pale gray, like ash, and in another entry as if glowing from within rather than reflecting light. He never once uses the word aliens, and generally avoids ready-made definitions, a fact that the researchers themselves later noted as an argument in favor of the text's authenticity, since someone who was fabricating a hoax would more likely have used established terminology from movies and TV shows, which, however, according to numerous accounts from those close to him, Ernesto himself never watched and openly despised. He describes the procedures he says he was subjected to, the touch of instruments that were as cold as ice, yet weightless, the sensation that measurements were being taken from his skin, just as a tailor takes measurements from fabric, and points to 2 specific places on his body, his right forearm and the base of his neck, where later, after he had disappeared again but was spotted by a truck driver in 2015, the witness managed to notice, in his own words, 2 identical round spots like burns, only without scabs. No medical professional was ever able to examine these marks in person, since Ernesto himself never allowed anyone to approach him after his only documented appearance. A special place in the notebook is occupied by entries that researchers later termed episodes of the presence of others, passages in which Ernesto describes how, in the very same space where he was being held, He would at times see or sense the presence of other people whom he could not make out clearly, but whose voices, according to him, were spoken in various languages, including, as it seemed to him, English and something resembling an Asian language that he could not identify. In one of his most disturbing entries, he writes, "There was a woman here. She was crying in her own language. I didn't understand the words, but I understood what she was crying about. It was the same thing that would have made Maricela cry, a statement that the investigation was never able to confirm or refute, but which, according to the psychologists invited by the family to analyze the text, indicates either an extremely developed capacity for empathic projection on the part of an exhausted and traumatized mind, or, as proponents of the anomalous theory insist, a literal experience of contact with other abducted people." The entries become increasingly fragmented and chaotic toward the end of the notebook. The handwriting sometimes shrinks to barely legible marks, and at other times, on the contrary, becomes sweeping, as if the writer had lost control of his hand for a few lines. Several pages deserve special attention, in which Ernesto tries to cling to something familiar, as if he were consciously searching his memory for a foothold that would prevent him from completely losing touch with his own identity. He lists the names in detail, almost obsessively. Maricela, Ruben, Yolanda, Jose Luis, the nickname of the old dog on the ranch, Canelo, and the number of the pen where he last saw the calf. He writes, "If I forget even one of these names, I will cease to be myself, so I repeat them while my hand still obeys me." And on the next page, he does indeed repeat the same list twice more, in handwriting that grows smaller with each repetition, as if he were trying to fit as many repetitions as possible into the limited space on the page. In one of his entries, he describes an episode he himself calls a return for a second. He writes that suddenly, without any transition, he felt beneath his feet not the smooth floor of his inexplicable dungeon, but the dry, cracked earth of the northern pen. He smelled the sun-warmed wormwood and heard, clearly, as if in real life, Jose Luis's voice on the radio asking if those were headlights. "It lasted no longer than a heartbeat," he writes, "and then the walls again, the sunless light again, and I don't know if it was real or if I just want it to be real." It was precisely this passage that the psychiatrists who studied the text cited as the most telling example of a dissociative intrusion, of a traumatic memory into current experience, a condition well described in the clinical literature on post-traumatic stress. Whereas proponents of the anomalous interpretation viewed it as evidence of a literal, albeit brief, rupture in the structure of the phenomenon itself that had been holding it in place. Toward the end of the notebook, in its most chaotic pages, Ernesto returns several times to describing his attempts at resistance. Not physical resistance, since, in his own words, his body would at times stop obeying him, as if in a dream, where you want to run but your legs won't move, but rather attempts to keep his mind clear. He describes how he counted his own breaths and tried to mentally repair the fence of the northern pen, board by board, post by post, a task he knew so well it had become second nature, which, in his words, was the only thing that remained mine, that no one could take away from me. In one of the entries, dated, insofar as one can even speak of dates in this text, according to his own internal reckoning, around the 39th day, he describes the only episode in all that time that he interpreted as an attempt at communication. A delicate, almost childlike voice addressing him as he perceived it, not with words, but right into my head, as if it were a thought that wasn't mine, asking, if his account is to be believed, "Why are you afraid of the light when you yourself are made of light?" Ernesto writes that he couldn't think of a reply, and that this question haunted him more than any of the procedures he had undergone, because there was no threat in it, only genuine incomprehension, as if it were asked by a child who had never seen darkness. The last entry, which breaks off mid-sentence on about the 50th page, reads, "Today, if you can call it today, I heard a sound like a door opening, and I thought that maybe this was the end. But then I realized it was the beginning all over again, and I don't even know how many times this has happened, because I lost count somewhere around." And the text ends there, leaving half the page blank. As expected, experts' reactions to the discovery of the notebook were mixed. Leticia Flores Arango, a forensic handwriting expert with the Chihuahua State Prosecutor's Office, who had been examining the document for nearly 4 months, confirmed in her official report, a high degree of similarity between the handwriting and known samples of Ernesto's handwriting, but at the same time noted an inexplicable inconsistency in the very structure of the writing, changes in pressure and slant, which are typically associated with long-term emotional and physiological changes in a person, occurred within the text too abruptly and too systematically for the normal progression of stress over months or years, as if the author were experiencing states that alternated without a smooth transition. A chemical analysis of the ink, conducted by an independent laboratory at the family's request, revealed that the ballpoint pen used matched common models sold in Mexico in the early 2000s, meaning that, theoretically, Ernesto could have had such a pen from the start, or the kidnapper himself could have given it to the abductors if the theory of a criminal kidnapping is correct. Forensic psychiatrists who were brought in after the discovery gained public attention in 2016 offered an explanation based on a dissociative reaction to prolonged traumatic isolation, a condition in which a person held in conditions of sensory deprivation or extreme stress may indeed lose track of time and create figurative, metaphorical descriptions of the violence they have experienced. One of the psychiatrists, however, in a private conversation with a journalist, admitted that in his entire career, he had never encountered a case of dissociative disorder in which a patient, especially someone with no prior history of mental disorders and no access to literature on such conditions, would construct such an internally consistent, imagery-rich narrative system, repeated over 50 pages, instead of the fragmented and contradictory narrative typical of trauma. This theory explains a lot, but it does not account for two specific facts that the investigation has been unable to resolve: the complete absence of any physical traces of the kidnappers at the site of the disappearance, and the origin of the notebook itself. If Ernesto was held captive for 12 years by people somewhere in the same region, it remains inexplicable how a tin box containing the notebook ended up buried on the grounds of his own ranch, in the immediate vicinity of that very scorched circle discovered back in 2003, especially since, throughout those 12 years, volunteers, the police, and the family themselves regularly searched the area and, according to them, found nothing of the sort there. Skeptics, including several journalists who specialize in debunking paranormal stories, have put forward an alternative explanation. Ernesto, suffering from an unspecified mental disorder, staged his own abduction, hid for many years in remote areas of the Sierra or outside the state, periodically returning to the ranch, and buried the notebook himself shortly before a truck driver spotted him in 2015. This version explains the absence of footprints and the presence of the notebook on the ranch grounds, but it runs up against its own weaknesses. It does not explain either the footprints that stopped after 2 steps, as recorded in the report dated March 7, 2003, nor the consistent and independent testimony of 3 witnesses from that same night, nor the behavior of the search dogs, nor the fact that the ground within the scorched circle defies a standard explanation involving a bonfire or chemical burn. Moreover, it is doubtful that a man who had been deliberately hiding from his own family for 12 years would have returned to the pasture at the very moment a random truck was passing by, and then would have fled so swiftly and warily that he wouldn't even let the driver, who clearly posed no threat, get close to him. None of the proposed rational explanations, as Agent Dominguez Reyes, who had retired by that point, admitted in a final interview with local television, does not capture the whole picture. Each explains part of it, and none explains the rest. After the story of the notebook came to light in 2016, the Garcia Villarreal case first spread beyond the state of Chihuahua and attracted the attention of national and, to some extent, international researchers of unexplained phenomena, including several Mexican ufologists who, even then, were drawing parallels with the state-recognized incident over Campeche in 2004, insisting that both cases point to the systemic, rather than isolated, nature of such phenomena in Mexican airspace. One of the national television networks produced a half-hour segment on the case, featuring José Luis Ramos, who was already getting on in years at the time but was still working at a neighboring ranch, and Benjamin Ochoa Rios, a long-haul truck driver who admitted on camera that, in all the years since, he had never once driven that stretch of Route 49 after sunset if he had the option to take a different route. The program sparked a wave of reactions. Some viewers wrote that they were willing to believe any version except that the notebook was genuine, since that would mean that something inexplicable and indefensible is still happening somewhere. Others, on the contrary, accused the skeptical journalists of being heartless toward the family, who had waited 12 years for any news at all. An independent investigator from Mexico City, who had been studying the case for nearly 2 years, published an open letter calling on the state prosecutor's office to provide the materials for a new, more thorough chemical analysis. The letter received no official response. Several foreign publications specializing in unexplained phenomena, including one American and one Spanish, translated excerpts from the notebook and published them alongside articles about the zone of silence and the incident over Campeche, acknowledged by the Mexican military, presenting the case of Garcia Villarreal as possibly the most thoroughly documented case of its kind in Latin America, a characterization that the local prosecutor's office subsequently neither publicly confirmed nor denied, limiting itself to a brief statement that the case remains under investigation. Maricela Ortiz, who was 53 years old at the time the notebook was found, stopped making public appearances by the end of 2017, stating in her last interview with reporters that she did not want the memory of her husband to become a spectacle for the curious. Ruben continues to run the La Esmeralda ranch to this day, although, according to neighbors, he has significantly reduced the number of head of cattle in the northern corral and, according to rumors, generally tries to stay away from the area at the foot of the hill after dark. According to the latest available information, Yolanda lives in the city of Chihuahua under an assumed name and does not have any contact with journalists. Since then, and it has been nearly 10 years since the notebook was found, there have been, although locals in the vicinity of the zone of silence continue from time to time to recount casual sightings of a solitary human figure on the edge of the desert at twilight, stories that have never been documented with any degree of certainty, and which the family itself prefers not to comment on. The case has been officially entered into the RNP-DNO database as unsolved, with no suspects identified and no legal declaration of death. Maricela, according to available information, still refuses to initiate the process of having her husband declared dead, despite more than 20 years having passed, because, as she once told a local journalist, "As long as there is no body, for me, there is no proof that he is gone." The metal tin box and the notebook were transferred to the Chihuahua State Attorney General's office archives for permanent storage. The chemical composition of the ink used on the last, most fragmented pages, according to an unpublished but leaked addendum to the expert report, differs slightly but consistently from the ink on the first pages of the same notebook, a difference that the laboratory attributed to natural oxidation of the ink under different storage conditions, but which remained unverified by independent experts, as researchers were no longer granted access to the archival materials. A scrap of the canvas poncho in which the box had been wrapped was identified by the family as belonging to Ernesto. According to Maricela, one exactly like it had been hanging on a hook in the tool shed for many years before his disappearance. But it proved impossible to determine exactly when the fabric had ended up underground using modern methods. It had been in the soil for too long, erasing most of the traces that could have been used for dating. The gully itself, where Ruben found the box, had been filled in and reinforced with stones at the family's initiative back in 2016, partly to protect the site as a potential piece of evidence, and partly, as Ruben himself later admitted, because no one in the family could bear to look at that hole anymore. The burnt circle, discovered in 2003, has become almost completely overgrown with shrubs and dusty steppe grass, typical of this part of the Chihuahuan desert over the past decades, and today it blends in completely with the surrounding landscape, except that, according to the few visitors to this place, the soil there is noticeably denser and drier even after the rainy season, as if something in its structure has never fully recovered. The Garcias Villarreal's neighbors claim that the cattle at La Esmeralda still avoid this section of the corral for no apparent reason, circling around it in a wide arc, an observation that has never been documented by experts, but which has been independently reported by 3 generations of ranch workers. What happened to Ernesto Garcia Villarreal on the night of March 7, 2003, on the pasture of the La Esmeralda ranch? A question that, more than 2 decades later, still has no single answer that satisfies the investigators, the family, and the experts who have studied the case. 3 stationary lights, spotted by 4 different people on the same night. A footprint on the damp ground that stopped 2 steps short. A scorched circle that hadn't been there the night before. A notebook found 12 years later, buried on his own ranch, the contents of which can neither be fully confirmed nor fully refuted. And the man whom people may have seen once in the year 2015, aged, silent, walking off toward the hills, where, According to legends that have been passed down in this part of Mexico for nearly a century, time flows differently than anywhere else. What do you think actually happened to Ernesto Garcia Villarreal that night, where, according to legends that have been passed down in this part of Mexico for nearly a century, time flows differently than anywhere else? What do you think actually happened to Ernesto Garcia Villarreal that night?